Guerrillas become bandits. The new ideology, the ideology goes from, secular leftist nationalist to religious or kind of ethno-terrorist, whatever, or there's no ideology at all. The police forces maybe are disbanded, but they don't necessarily go away. And so you have, networks of people who know how to smuggle, to ambush, to kidnap, interrogate, torture, fight asymmetrical wars. So this is, this is a condition one finds all over the global South, and it is the legacy of the Cold War. And the other pre-existing crisis that climate change interacts with is the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring, which begins in the early 80s in response to the exhaustion of the post-war economic model, which is responsible for the golden era of world capitalism, the sort of long expansion after World War II, which sees rising wages and rising profits and rising taxes and, sort of successful growth of the capitalist economic model until around the late 60s when profit rates begin to decline. And at that point, elites begin to turn away from Keynesianism, broadly defined as a economic theory that sees that redistributing some wealth and power to the working classes is beneficial for capitalism because workers have to buy soap for soap factories to stay in business and therefore capitalists to make profits. So that whole theory goes out the window, and the kind of fringe minority ideas associated with Hayek and Friedman take center stage, and by the end of the 70s, these theories are the dominant theories in the West, and you have this shift away from stimulating the economy through demand management in the form of allowing unions to bid up wages, or redistributing wealth in the form of welfare payments or free health care and free education. And you get the permanent austerity agenda, which we're still living under, which is about lowering wages and lowering the tax bill on capital so that the share of the national income that goes to capital, to the owners of property, increases. And this is in response to the collapse of the profit rate of the post-war model. And the story with the kind of golden era of capitalism is based on the destruction of World War II. So you have, during World War II, not just the death of millions of people, but the destruction of billions and billions of dollars worth of capital. Whole cities wiped off the face of the planet. Massive amounts of infrastructure just ruined. The process of rebuilding the core capitalist economies in the world, Japan and Europe primarily, is essentially the basis for this long boom in which, say, in the United States, you could have conditions where there were rising wages for workers, there were very high rates of taxation on business, and there were massive expansions in government spending, and there were still record profits. And what happens by the late 60s, early 70s, is that the world economy has essentially recovered from the devastation of World War II. The build-out is complete. And there's finally just too much stuff and not enough people who can buy it. Of course, there's plenty of human need. There's still children all over the planet who don't have shoes, but everybody who can afford blue jeans and washing machines pretty much has them by 1970. And so you get overproduction, the return of the classic crisis that capitalism always faces, which is the problem of too much success. It's too good at producing wealth at the expense of nature, etc. Leaving all that aside for a moment. Too good at producing wealth. So you get this shift in thinking towards austerity. So in the late 70s, going into the 1980s, this leads to a kind of not just a shift in policy, but a dramatic ideological shift among elites in the West, that they shift away from seeing the state as having an important role in capitalism towards denigrating the state and trying to reduce it at every turn. And this is Thatcherism, Reaganism, and we're seeing it still today. So what that has done in the global South is created massive inequality. There was always inequality in many developing economies, but neoliberalism is when it is successful in its own terms and when it fails in its own terms. And its own terms are to revive capitalist growth and profitability. And it frequently fails in those terms. So the decade of the 1980s, when Latin America was subject to vicious neoliberalism, there wasn't really high rates of growth. It didn't really live up to what it said it was going to do. But it did create lots of inequality. Because it led to upward transfer of wealth to elites. Sometimes neoliberalism sort of can deliver on what it says. It doesn't make claims to fairness and justice. It makes claims to high rates of economic growth. So you have India since 1991 has been liberalizing, and you have high rates of economic growth. But you also have massive inequality. This is important because inequality is associated with relative deprivation. People rebel and turn against the system they live in, not simply because they're suffering, not simply because of absolute deprivation. If that were the case, then the poorest people in the world would always be rebelling, right? What causes rebellion and criminality and a rethink of whatever accepted ideas you have is relative deprivation. Experiencing your suffering as unjust and not natural and not necessary and possible to change because you experience it in relationship to what other people have, in relationship to what used to be, in relationship to what could be according to some political or moral theory. So relative deprivation and inequality are linked, and that's heavily destabilizing from a sort of military political point of view. The other thing that neoliberalism does is it just dismantles the developmentalist state in the global South. So the state is forced through the debt crisis, which I could talk about in more detail if you want, is forced to, debt crisis of the 1980s, forced to sell off state assets, sell the state airline, sell the state utility company, sell the ports, privatize public education, privatize the healthcare system. In other words, reduce the state to a shell of its former self. Not that developmentalist states in the global South in places like Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia were wonderful models to follow, but they were more robust bureaucracies with greater capacity than many states in the global South are today after 30 years of neoliberalism. So now onto this now comes the effects of anthropogenic climate change in the form of extreme weather. Increased drought and desertification, increased flooding, and the pattern that you see across much of the planet is a tendency towards increased desertification while there's actually an increase in overall rates of precipitation. So where I opened the book was in the Horn of Africa and Kenya, where there's massive problems with desertification, and this is exacerbating cattle raiding, which is a traditional part of the pastoralist economy, but now people are doing this with the weaponry left over from the Cold War, and cattle raids are turning into massacres. And this is people trying to adapt to climate change because the environment is collapsing. There's a massive drought in northern Kenya, which leads to the death of cattle herds, et cetera, et cetera. So people try and adapt to this however they can. They can't turn to the state because the state has no capacity to help them. So the Kenyan state, one of the first states forced to undergo structural adjustment by the IMF and World Bank, beginning in the early 90s, really doesn't have much of an agricultural extension program. It really doesn't have many veterinary services. It doesn't even have much like well drilling capacity. Not that the way you should deal with a drought is by mining ancient groundwater, but that would be a short-term solution. They can't even drill more wells for these pastoralists. So the pastoralists converge around whatever water holes are left over, and they fight it out, and the death toll is increasing. And what the state does have is an overdeveloped repressive capacity. So the paramilitary police go in, they dress in fatigues, they carry long arms, they have helicopter support, and they engage in firefights with the Turkana and Samburu and Maasai pastoralists, and there's lots of cross-border violence that goes with this. And the Ugandan military follows Kenyan herders across the border, and you have a condition that's akin to war, but it's really just about survival. And so this combination of these three things I call the catastrophic convergence, and the book sort of unpacks how this plays out in different parts of the world. And it's not always that neoliberalism and the legacy of Cold War militarism play equal parts that are now joined by climate change. In some situations, like in Afghanistan, there really never was a program of neoliberal economic restructuring. The crisis there is a product of Cold War militarism. In places like Mexico, there wasn't really that much of a Cold War proxy fight in Mexico. There were some guerrillas in the early 70s in Guerrero and Oaxaca, but that's not what explains the sort of generalized social crisis in northern Mexico. That's a product of neoliberal economic restructuring in the form of NAFTA, which has done all those things I outlined, reduced the state. So that's the sort of the argument of the book, and there's a lot of history and specific geography in it. But the broader aspect of this that is relevant here in the U.S. is the question of adaptation and mitigation in developed economies, and that is frequently what is kind of more urgent for audiences like yourself. I don't know what is more urgent for you guys. I'll find out in a second when I open up the questions. But in that regard, I think it's important to think about climate change. And just to interrupt myself, I have not gone over the basic science of this because I'm sort of assuming you all sort of have some sense of that, but I'm glad to answer any questions about that as best I can. But suffice it to say, burning fossil fuels leads to overloading greenhouse gases, which trap sunlight and heat and making the climate system unravel. I think it's important to see climate change as a distinct piece of a generalized environmental crisis. It can seem like it is the entire thing because the implications of it, if left unchecked, are so cataclysmic and apocalyptic that we can start thinking that it is the entire problem. It's not. And it's important to break it out because it does deserve immediate attention. And it essentially, if we can deal with climate change, what we do is we buy time to deal with other environmental crises like the increasing toxicity in the environment, deforestation, overfishing, soil degradation. It's like scientists have like 9 different planetary limits that they think industrial civilization has crossed. So getting off of fossil fuels isn't going to solve all that. But we cannot just treat it like a problem that we have 70 years to deal with. I mean, it has to be dealt with right now. And that means that capitalism, as it currently exists, has to confront this problem, or it's essentially not going to be dealt with. And the good news is that the core capitalist economies and the developing economies, but definitely the core capitalist economies and the rising sort of core, the new core of Asia and China, definitely have the means to do this. In the United States, we have the laws to do it. It's the Clean Air Act of 1970, amended in 1991, which is then modified by the lawsuit Massachusetts versus EPA, affirmed by the Supreme Court in 2007, which says that, in fact, greenhouse gases must be covered under the Clean Air Act because they harm human health, and therefore the EPA has the obligation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The implications of that are enormous. And the great tragedy of the first Obama term was that there was all of this time and energy and money wasted on trying to come up with comprehensive climate legislation. In the Senate and the House both had these bills that were not very good, had very lame targets. The Senate bill actually would have stripped the EPA of the power to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So this was a waste of time and money because the fact of the matter is we already have the law. And I can talk more about the implications of the Clean Air Act later. Do we have the technology? Yes. It's not like we haven't developed commercial scale, utility scale, clean energy technology. It exists. Is there the money? Yes. The corporate sector is sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since 1956, according to the Federal Reserve. $2 trillion. This is not money that is being given out as bonuses to CEOs. It's not money that's being given out to shareholders. This is money retained by firms for investment after they have paid all of that other stuff. And it's usually parked in very low yield, short-term government securities, and they're waiting for cues on what to do. Also, the federal government and state governments together are actually a very large part of the U.S. economy. And this is something that progressives and liberals don't make enough of, I think. And partly it's because the right makes such a big deal of it. You know, Grover Norquist goes around talking about how the federal government is too big. He says it's about 25% of the U.S. GDP. If you add, without double counting money that the feds give to the states, if you add state and federal economic activity, it's over 1/3 of the U.S. economy. So progressives don't talk about this, you know, because we're kind of like taking the bait that government is bad. But think about it. What could we do with that? The federal government owns 450 buildings, most of them large, as we were discussing earlier, completely wasteful office buildings. They consume enormous amounts of electricity and heat and air conditioning. The federal government has hundreds of thousands of vehicles in its fleet. The post office alone has about 140,000 vehicles, the vast majority of which, other than these long-term, you know, long-distance trucks, the vast majority of them drive about 18 miles a day and park in the same place every night. Absolutely no reason those couldn't be electric vehicles. Why can't the federal government and the states commit themselves to purchasing clean energy? They have to buy energy. They have to keep the lights on these buildings. They have to buy vehicles. They have to buy fuel for those vehicles. Why can't there be a commitment to buying clean energy? The U.S. actually has some of the strictest sort of national origin procurement laws in the world. You know, the federal government and state governments do not buy the cheapest typewriters, or not typewriters, but, you know, computers. There's a minimum. They may in fact buy typewriters. We might be better off if they were still buying typewriters instead of stuff from Microsoft. But you know, there's minimum national origin rules. So why not have an agenda of clean power? And in fact, the Obama administration, Obama issued an executive order in his first term stipulating that this should be done, and for political reasons this was essentially dropped. But so we have the laws, we have the technology, we have the money. The point about this government spending stuff is that you don't need Republican permission to do this. You know, you don't have to get John Boehner to believe in science. The federal government is going to, you know, spend money on this stuff. So why not use those resources, and the states as well? And if all of that were embraced, I think it would not be out of the question to start really dealing with climate change. And if the government sector led in consuming green products, it would essentially create markets. And then the nascent clean tech sector would achieve economies of scale that would allow it to compete with the dirty tech sector. So right now, you know, electric vehicles are just a little bit more than diesel and gasoline vehicles, and so there's like these elaborate and lame Rube Goldberg type federal schemes to give you credits and blah 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 if you buy these electric vehicle trucks. But if the federal government just started buying electric vehicles, then the electric vehicle manufacturers would achieve economies of scale. They could lower the price, and then it would be economically feasible and sensible for the private sector to start buying vehicles in the same fashion. So too, if the federal government were like laying out schedules where like we're going to, you know, have this much wind, solar, hydro, blah blah blah, you know, sourcing our infrastructure in DC by this year, you know, you would have this infrastructure that would also create economies of scale into which the private sector could buy in. So this is not a blueprint for socialism. This is not even a blueprint for addressing the great constellation of problems that is the environmental crisis, but it is, I think, a realistic response to what is undeniably the greatest crisis humanity has yet faced. I mean, the science on this, which I have not talked about, is really, really serious and really, really clear. And one of the worst parts of it is that it's now become pretty certain that the climate system doesn't change as gradually as was once thought. So in the early 80s, there was this fringe theory that the climate system switched all at once, that causes would build up and effects would lag, and then they would kick in, and that maybe ice ages started and stopped in matters of decades rather than centuries. And sure enough, that's what they think has happened. And sort of final confirmation of this was when the ice cores in Greenland were withdrawn and analyzed, and that was only in the late 90s that was done. And they could see from that, these really clear year-by-year records, that there were in fact these sudden shifts in the climate regime. There wasn't this gradual change. There was this idea of building up and then tipping. So, we really have to act urgently, and that's why I proposed this very seemingly, unrevolutionary, unhip response. And it's not to say that capitalism can make peace with nature. It's not to say that all environmental problems are climate change, but it's just to say that if the climate science is real, and I think it is, then we have to give special attention to a short-term and immediate response to this crisis. So, on that note, I would open it up for your questions.
Yeah.
Hi.
You want to?
Yeah,
okay.
You spoke a lot about the global south, and I was in India. I think it's very interesting, that they're coming from having decades of at least a self-declared socialist government, and then which achieved significant gains actually through not very environmentally sound practices like eradicating mosquitoes with pesticides and
the Green Revolution.
Green Revolution, GMO crops, which are now sort of blowing up in their faces a bit with farmer suicides and serious issues around that. So, and it's just kind of recently the two Marxist governments have fallen in Kerala and West Bengal. So I'm just curious, what happened here, and would socialism be viable for countries like India in the future? How would
that's a really, really broad question. Would socialism be viable for in India in the future? Yes, if it were, if there were the right conditions, if people agitated for it and were committed to it and could build it, But in the short term, what's going on is there's a war linked to these very same policies that you mentioned, the Naxalite rebellion, and I have several chapters in my book on India. You can chart the link between the drought and the Naxalites. The Naxalites began in West Bengal in 1967. There was a massacre in Naxalbari, which is a district in Darjeeling, named for the tea, and this was a massacre of protesters who were protesting peacefully, and out of that grew this Maoist insurgency in which there have been, a changing constellation of parties that have split and reunited over the years. And for a long time, the Naxalites were up in West Bengal primarily, but in the last 10, 15 years, drought has really come down the eastern side of India. If you were to draw it, it's like this. Oh, we don't even have pens. What is this?
Smart words.
I'm against technology. I can talk about that if you want.
The other one is good.
There's not any pens. Anyway, so here's India. So your east is this one, I think, right? Yeah. So there's the eastern and western Ghats, which are these mountain ranges, and the Deccan Plateau in the center of India. And so the drought has gone down the eastern Ghats, and district by district, drought-affected districts are, you can lay over a map of where there's Naxalite activity, and district for district it matches up with the drought. So I went there to try and figure out what was the connection, and the connection is the credit markets and neoliberalism. The withdrawal of the state has left farmers at the mercy of moneylenders. And this is not my original research. This is the research of an economist who teaches in Hyderabad, who got his PhD at UMass Amherst in the economics department, which is like one of the only kind of Marxist economics departments left in the country, that and Salt Lake City and
New school.
what?
New school.
Yeah, New school. So the money lenders don't want the land. They'll only lend for crops, and the only crop they'll lend for is cotton, because if they advance money for food seed in a crisis, the farmers can steal the collateral, eat the food. But the only thing you can do with cotton is turn it into money. And so they plant more and more cotton. It's GMO cotton, which is destroying the land. And people are going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt and committing suicide. 2,000 farmers. This was in Andhra Pradesh where I was doing this research. And 2,000 people have committed suicide there, 2,000 farmers. Across India, it's about 200,000 farmers. And you can imagine how, if you're on the verge of committing suicide and the Naxalites show up and they say, hey, we've got a short-term and a long-term solution to your problem. Short-term solution, moneylender comes to the village, we kill them. And cops come to investigate, we ambush them. Long-term solution, Maoist revolution in India. Whether or not you buy the long-term solution, if you're like about to drink the pesticides, which is how most of the farmers commit suicide, why not put that off and kill the moneylender? Why not support the Naxalites a bit? And so, that's part of how the, neoliberalism and drought interact through the credit markets and these GMO seeds to fuel violence. As for predicting the future of socialism in India, I don't know. I can do that. Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's good. We'll go and then Alex.
Looks like you knew a lot about India, and I was just reading this Martin Luther King when he went over to India in the late 50s, and he said that out of 400 million people that live there, 365 million of the people earn less than $60 a year. And I don't know as much. I haven't read about the history of India or what's been happening since then. Could you give me like a 30-second rundown on like industrialization, like how they was progressing?
India didn't industrialize that much. There was the kind of nominally socialist mixed economy that sought to industrialize in the 1960s and really messed up in that it favored the industrial sector over the agricultural sector, and this led to famines, which then kind of like brought to heel the economic independence of socialist India. It wasn't particularly socialist. And it was in response to this kind of mismanagement of economic policy, of over-focusing on industrialization at the expense of the agricultural sector, which is most of the sector, most of the economy in India, that forced India to then embrace the Green Revolution. And since then, you've seen increased urbanization, increased capitalization of Indian agriculture, and there was a significant element in the Green Revolution that was, developmentalist. There was a place for controlling prices, for protecting markets, for state intervention, and I mean this is the story of how capitalism actually develops everywhere. You read economic history, this is how it actually happens. It doesn't happen with open markets. It happens when states protect and plan markets and build up national capitalists and create national champion firms. And so India miscalculated, and that kind of opened the door to the Green Revolution, and that has led to rising inequality. But I should say I'm not really an expert on India. I mean, I was really just looking at this one specific question.
It's a coincidence because of America when at that same time in history, like that we started getting so capital, our system became so obsessed with capitalism that they did kind of the same mistake.
No, it was what was going on was with the Green Revolution was it was an attempt. It was a technocratic attempt to do economic combat with the socialist camp. And, coming out of World War II, the position of the West is that capitalism has to win on all fields, ideologically, militarily, but also economically. And you have to deliver. And so there was room for allowing, there was a very different set of policies than obtained today. It was not about reducing the state, not about austerity. It was about trying to get economies in the global south to have growth and employment, et cetera, so there wouldn't be revolution. And the honest belief at USAID and state and all of that was that modern agricultural technology was the way to do that. And if you look at like a 2 or 3 year time frame, yeah, you definitely increase yields. And yields did increase, but so too did poverty and inequality. But so then what happens is in 1991, India starts liberalizing, and what you get isn't so much industrialization, but the rise of the business service sector, and that's been the real kind of growth area of capitalist India is technology, IT, and business services.
Okay. So we have Alex. Sorry, Ed, and then.
So, in a political climate of neoliberalism where the state is being reduced and reduced and reduced, and in terms of what our options are presented as, our options for state spending are often presented as ultimatums. Like you can have this state expense, but then we're going to have to cut back on this side, as if there's no alternative. And definitely with the socialist perspective, you bring a different idea to that. But I feel like a lot of the movements against climate change have been not necessarily have been outright not sensitive to the needs and realities of working people and poor people. And how can we launch a campaign for something as important as climate change without selling out all of the people who could potentially be affected by, for instance, like an ultimatum that says, well, we can have this state spending on the renovation of all of these state buildings and state cars. That costs a lot of money to do that. I mean, you definitely have the money, but it's often presented as this ultimatum of we can have this or we can have that. And how do we get a response to climate change without selling out working people?
Well, it's difficult. I don't know, but I mean, part of it is arguing for a correct, a proper political economy, really understanding how capitalism works, and that means recognizing the role of the state in capitalist development and making the case for state intervention, not just a moral case that hey, poor children deserve to go to school and have something to eat, but also making a technocratic case, which is reminding people that there wouldn't be any iPhone if there wasn't all that military R&D that went into it, all that socialism that developed the stuff and gives it away. Reminding people of that, actually, the way it actually works is not what they tell you, and it's not what a lot of progressives imagine. It's certainly not what a lot of environmentalists imagine. Another key thing, I think, another kind of shibboleth that people need to be disabused of is population. Population is not the issue. Distribution is the issue. And this kind of neo-Malthusianism is a big problem among Greens, and it has to be confronted directly, and you gotta bone up on your arguments and be able to check these misrepresentations when you see them and make a better case for how we should proceed forward, which is through increased, an increased role for the state, increased regulation, checking the power of the market, making people think about distribution and not population. I think, will that work? I don't know, but.
I have a related question to the last one. I think we don't have to, it doesn't really merit that much, discussion that, this is a more reformist, immediate strategy, and not, we're not talking, we all recognize that we have to make some more immediate goals, but my worry for something, a proposal like this, talking about this immediate state intervention that the Obama administration can do right now, is that it feeds into the hands of a lot of people who don't really have the kind of far-sighted political economic thinking that we do. Mostly just thinking of that, I might be biased because I'm at Columbia, where the sustainable development idea is run by Jeffrey Sachs and is mostly a training ground for the World Bank. But I feel like this idea of just investment in green technology often plays into the hands of people who see this as kind of just a technological fix for climate change, rather than and which can avoid not as a step to greater social and economic change, but as a way to prevent that. So how do we go about this goal that we know we need to do in the immediate future without playing into the hands of the Jeffrey Sachs of the world who just wanted a technological fix?
Well, I think that it's about adding the parts that they leave out and criticizing the parts that, the other parts of their political economy that need to be criticized, like their neoliberal position on the state. And, Jeffrey Sachs has never answered for his role in creating structural adjustment in Bolivia. If you ask him about this in an interview, he'll hang up the phone. Doug Henwood has interviewed him several times and has both times tried to broach this subject, and he's just told me, he said, if you ask any more about this, the interview is over. So, these people are, they're slippery, they don't play by the same set of rules that they hold for other people. So this is what I would say in all these, answers to how do we do the complicated thing. I think there's unfortunately no shortcut to having a better argument. And part of it gets down to form. And I know we all have to have these short-term interventions. We have to be tactical, but we also have to be strategic. Everybody's got to tweet, except I don't tweet. I'm not on Facebook. But, I think that progressive socialists also have to think critically about this whole landscape of total bullshit that has descended over America. I mean, it's just like the levels of total horseshit around technology are stunning. And what it is doing to people's thinking is absolutely appalling. I would suggest just check out, like I saw it last night on an airplane, Gavin Newsom, who used to be the mayor of San Francisco when I lived there, being interviewed by Stephen Colbert with his new book about citizenship, Citizenville. I mean, this is where so much of the left is at, that if we tweet more, if we get more likes on Facebook, then we're going to win. It's like, never mind the argument. This is like, the fact of the matter is, you can't push a better argument on Twitter. And you can't educate people by getting them to like your little post that they're not even going to read on Facebook. And there's no shortcut, You got to also do that to for what it is, to keep people pulled in, to communicate that there's this event going on. But if we think that that's where political discourse happens, game over. Just give it to the other side. We're not going to make the case in 140 characters. So it's to make these complicated points, which is that yes, there's a contradiction in our position. We want wind farms. Yes, it's going to be capitalist firms that build them. In the next 5 or 10 years, who's going to build major wind farms in the United States? It's not going to be Occupy Wall Street. It's going to be some capitalist firm. They should be regulated. They should pay union wages, et cetera, et cetera. Is this a contradiction that's hard to understand with a long-term vision? Well, then there has to be time made to explain this and to think about it and read into it. I don't know, maybe that's a lame answer, or just an old-fashioned answer, but I don't think there's any shortcut.
So I have Liz and then Yanni. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more after that. Does anybody else have...
Sorry to be such a potty mouth, but I'm just so sick of this technology, this Twittering and all this stuff.
Okay. Well, why don't we go to Liz?
So one of the things about climate change is, it's affecting everywhere in the world, but seems to be more extremely affecting the area in between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and so which happens to be the poorer area of the world. So how do you, and I'm sure your book addresses part of this, but how do you see the rhetoric around climate change being distorted because we don't have suburban moms stabbing each other over access to clean water for their children, whereas in Bolivia or Kenya, that's an actual issue, is because of famine or drought or whatever.
How do we address climate change in a developed economy where there's a considerable buffer?
Yeah.
Well, one thing is that there's less and less of a buffer. You had Irene year before last, you got Sandy this year. It's more and more people are getting hit directly and losing everything they own, and they're not reduced to stabbing each other in water lines. But I think part of it is by connecting these events, of which there are going to be more and more, to the larger issue and getting the time frame right. This is happening now. A friend of mine, Rob Eshelman, who's a journalist who's currently working on a TV series, just went down to Texas, where Cargill shut a 2,000 person abattoir. They're slaughtering cattle in the Panhandle of Texas, and they're closing it because there's no cattle, because the drought in the Midwest and the South has gone on and on. Which drought is it? There's a drought, then it breaks, but whatever. It's been like 5 years of like persistent and increasing drought. There's no cattle, and they're moving the plant north. So there's more and more stuff like that where people actually feel it, and I think it's important to explain those events in their proper context, which is the science of climate change plus economic policy, choices that the state is making, that the political class is making to help or to not help, to how, and I think I think basically what's going to happen increasingly in the core economies is the state is going to come back in response to these emergencies. And it is not necessarily going to be a progressive response. The state's going to come back, and it's either going to be like police state, keeping the increasingly climate battered have-nots away from the haves, or it can be through emergency response, possibly a more progressive state, where the reality of our mutual dependence is made apparent to us when the infrastructure that we all depend on, like the subway, floods, and we realize, oh, actually, we are all in this together. There is no private individual strategy. Oh, and in fact, the private sector, in fact, the public sector isn't just a wasteful thing. They got the subway, the flooded subway, up and running again in a week, and using these opportunities to make broader points.
So I have a couple of questions here. And when you were talking about I agreed with your analysis of the problem of climate change, but when you talked about the solution of, for example, regulating different capitalist productions, I have the question of Jacobin's paradox, which talks about the, so for example, using the example of cars, if you have greener cars, you have more miles per gallon, but at a net level, it would be a lot less efficient. And so the cars that we had in the 1900s were inefficient. On a net level, it was a lot better. People biked, they used walking, etc. So I have a question on, in addition to just large-scale social planning, advocacy and lobbying, which I'm kind of dubious about because it's, it's a hit and miss, to get Obama to instill these policies. There's no real guarantee of that. And at the same time, you have what's going on in Texas against the tar sand blockade, or more militant guerrilla actions, and you have that worldwide, like in Nigeria, you have a militant resistance against ExxonMobil. And is there really a future with just a democratic path towards an environmentally sustainable solution? And within the time period that we have, do we have an option of having just a democratic, nonviolent resolution or non-militant resolution towards a deindustrializing of various nodes of this?
Certainly. I'm all for direct action and militancy, and I think that that's what caused Obama to postpone approval of the Keystone Pipeline. And so, that's what's essential, is, creating disruption, creating a crisis for the political class so that they respond. I wouldn't call that violent. That's militant. I'd make a clear distinction. You fall into a trap if you start arguing about the morality of violence. Is it morally right to fight the U.S. government with violence? Sure, it's morally right. The U.S. government is incredibly violent, whatever. Is it practical? Does it make any political sense? Well, read the history of movements that have tried that. It doesn't work out. End up in jail, get infiltrated, get smashed up, destroyed. It doesn't work. So the question isn't, is it morally right? And so the question is, what's effective? So, and I support, militant, nonviolent direct action because it's effective, and I think it's also morally right. But that's actually, to be perfectly honest, almost beside the point. It's it's effective, and so that's why it should be embraced and used. And it then, if you read Fran Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, there's plenty of people critiques of that as being not sort of revolutionary enough. Adolph Reed would take issue with that. How many of you read poor people's movements? It's create disruption, and then there's going to be the advocates and leaders who broker the deal, but it's pretty clear that it's the disruption, it's the crisis that determines how big the deal is. And so I think that makes sense, and that's what the climate movement should do. And in terms of getting back, there's another thing I forgot about this. I think that Jim Schultz wrote a really good paper. He's at the Democracy Center down in Cochabamba, Bolivia, about this de facto global strategy that has emerged around attacking the infrastructure, and it kind of relates to your question too, attacking the infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry. That this has been fairly successful. I mean, it's not the winning strategy, but it's like if you look around in India and the US, various places, there have been victories in holding up the development of fossil fuels by attacking the infrastructure. And what that does is it mobilizes people using local issues to fight climate change. So the fight against, mountaintop removal in West Virginia, I was down there speaking to people there. People have been fighting that for 30 years. They're not that into climate change, a lot of them. They don't really care about it. And I gave them climate change talk, and a lot of them were like, they're like, well, what about, our mountains here? And it's like, fine, whatever. Whether you're fighting for your mountains here or you're fighting for the climate, it's like, keeping the coal in the ground, that's good. And so I think that infrastructure actually brings in a lot of local issues. People are concerned about air quality, water quality, landscape, various types of justice, and they then attack the infrastructure through direct action, through litigation, through legislation, and have had some success in blocking it.
So we have like 4 minutes remaining. Maybe one short question.
Yeah, I was just curious. You mentioned in your plan about the government's, retrofitting buildings and buying new clean vehicles and everything, as this is a practical solution, or at least first step toward a realistic solution to climate change. But I'm wondering how, you didn't speak much about how that may or may not relate to the international discussion about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So for instance, do you think that would be a sign from the U.S. government to developing countries that the U.S. government is actually starting to take this shit kind of seriously, and maybe then they would start to work, like China might start to make more serious strides? Or do you think that it would still take something like some sort of legislative action by the U.S. to really kind of cut down on? I mean, so I'm just trying to understand, I'm sort of like opposed to the idea of more climate legislation, because it's not going to go anywhere, And we already have the law. We have the Clean Air Act. We're waiting for basically about 30 different rules to be issued. So what happened was this, was affirmed in 2007, and Bush just ignored it. Obama came in and was like, yeah, we're going to take this seriously, put a fairly good person in charge of the EPA, Lisa Jackson. She was kept on a very tight leash and muzzled, and so they have not issued rules pursuant to the Clean Air Act. But the implications of it are immense. There's a really interesting paper by the Brookings Institute from some guy who had been at like AEI or somewhere, the American Enterprise Institute, before going to Brookings, some total free marketeer. And it's one of the best defenses of the Clean Air Act, because it's essentially this panicked condemnation of it. And it's like, you're like, wow, like I really hope this guy is, serious about the possible implications. And he pushes it a little too far, but he's like, this is a crazy law that was just way too broad when it was written. I mean, this would shut the economy down. This is totally crazy. We should trade it away for a carbon tax. And you're like, absolutely not. And I pray that you're right, that it could actually be this strong. And it is very potentially, like, if you read the law, it's like, wow, like, the implications of the Clean Air Act are pretty intense. It is a de facto carbon tax. It would mean that business would be free to burn coal and pollute the environment, and would just have to pay these enormous taxes. So that's a de facto fines. That's a de facto carbon tax. That would have massively transformative effects on the economy. So yeah, never mind the new climate legislation. We need to understand the Clean Air Act better, and we need to popularize an understanding of this. And the thing is, the U.S. has some of the strongest environmental laws in the world. It's just that they're violated all the time. A good the people who hipped me to this, who I think really have made this a national issue, are the Center for Biological Diversity. And they go around, they were started by basically ex-Earth First monkey wrenchers who realized they could do the same thing with the law. And an old friend of mine is one of their main attorneys. His first job for them was essentially shutting down the biggest off-road convention in the world because it was having a take on the milk vetch, which is entirely uncharismatic little weed that's only found in this part of California. And they were like, it's on the endangered species list, and you're creating a take, and therefore our little law shop of hippies is going to shut down this huge thing. And they don't always win, but then they cut these deals. They're like, we're going to take it to court. We're going to fight for the milk vetch, and we'll shut you all the way down. So it's like, okay, well, how about we, only use half the space we're using now? And they've had lots and lots of victories. And so it's clean air and clean water, Endangered Species Act, and that's why the Republicans are obsessed with these laws, because those laws are potentially the things that Rush Limbaugh describes them as. Economy wrecking, crazy. It's like, yeah, they're actually great laws. They're just violent all the time.
We're actually, so it is exactly 3:50, so it's perfect timing. So let's all give